Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we'll discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which also provide you the much important avenue to practice daily answer writing, in the first topic, we'll try to assess the advisory opinion which has been given by the Supreme Court to the President under the presidential reference which was made under Article 143 of the Constitution. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to assess the various issues revolving around the Aadhaar card considering the backdrop of its uses in the spatial intensive revision exercise in Bihar. Then from a simplified section, we'll take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you but also provide you the much important value addition keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2026. So, stay tuned. The lead editorial today raises some very important challenging questions related to the advisory opinion which has been given by the Supreme Court to the President under the presidential reference which was made under Article 143 of the Constitution, where the Supreme Court has held that the discretionary power of the governor is actually non-justiciable in the court and thus cannot be asked for a judicial review. This forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the issues related to the concept of federalism. So you guys can recall the landmark April 2025 judgment where Supreme Court held that governor as head of state does not have any specific constitutional discretionary power, specifically to actually kind of sit on the bills or withhold the assent on the bills which has been passed by the state legislature for an indefinite time period. And thus the Supreme Court basically ended up prescribing a specific time limit applicable on both governor as well as president to actually act upon the bills which has been already passed by the state legislature. So from your polity class, you guys can actually recall that in our country there are 2 important law-making bodies. One is Parliament, which make laws on the central subject. Then there is a state legislature which basically make laws on the state subject. The distinction which has been provided under the provisions of 7th schedule of the Constitution. Keep this in mind that even though governor as head of state does not form part of the state legislature, yet the governor plays a pivotal role in the law making process. Because any bill which has been passed by the state legislature can only become an act and thus brought into enforcement if it has received the assent by the governor. So in this context, let's first try to understand about the office of governor. First from the perspective of the prelims examination. So it is Article 153 of the Constitution which actually establishes governor as the chief executive head of the state. But keep this in mind that governor in this ceremonial position only act as de jure executive and not as de facto executive, because the real power of governance actually lies with the state legislature, which actually consists of the elected representative of the people. So it is basically the state legislature which makes the laws, and ultimately these laws are implemented by an executive body, that is Council of Minister, and this Council of Minister is headed by the Chief Minister. So, as per the constitutional article 163 itself, the governor basically act on aid and advice of this Council of Minister. Now let's pose a question in front of us here. Let's say for example there exists a very extraordinary multi-talented person like me. Can I become governor of more than one state because I am so talented? The answer is absolutely yes. And this was actually provided by the provisions of 7th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1956. So what is the appointment procedure for me to actually be appointed as a governor? So when our constitution makers were considering the appointment procedure for the governor as a head of state, they basically took inspiration from the Canadian Constitution, where as per the provisions of Article 155 of the Constitution, the governor is basically directly appointed by the president. Now some of you may argue that sir, as per the Article 75, just like Article 163, as per the provisions of Article 75. President acts on the advice of Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Prime Minister. And thus, as the appointment is being made by the President, who is working on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, basically Governor act as an extended arm of control by the central over the state legislature. And thus in this capacity, he basically act as agent of center. Keep this in mind that Supreme Court in Har Govind Pant versus Raghukul Tilak judgment of 1979 very categorically stated that there are some very important constitutional provisions which basically impart some very specific duties on the governor, and thus governor basically act as an independent constitutional body and not as office of employment under the central government. Thus, some of you may will actually get inspired to become the governor. What is the qualification requirement to become a governor? Keep this in mind that under the provisions of Article 157 of the Constitution, there is only two specific qualification requirement which has been enlisted. That is, you shall be citizen of India and you shall be at least 35 years of age. However, over a period of time, there has developed two important conventions as well. So let's say, for example, if you are being appointed as a governor of the state of Uttar Pradesh, you shall be an outsider there. So you shall be coming from a different state, and thus you do not have any vested interest in the local politics there. Second is that when President is doing such an appointment, the President may consult with the Chief Minister of the state to actually establish the principles of federalism. Now, as we have discussed and established that any such bill which is being enacted by the state legislature can only become an act if that bill has actually received the assent of the governor. Thus, governor has some very important legislative power as provided by the Constitution under Article 200 and 201 of the Constitution. So let's say, for example, in the first case, there are some ordinary bills which actually goes and lands on the table of the governor. The governor actually have four options. First, he actually finds all the provisions to be suitable, let's say for the development of the state, and thus end up giving assent to the bill. So now the bill will become an act. Congratulations. But let's say, for example, there is a specific provision which is not liked by the governor, and thus governor will end up withholding his assent. The third option is where the governor can actually return the bill for the reconsideration of the state legislature. Keep this in mind that the similar powers also lies with the President under Article 111 of the Constitution, and thus President plays an integral part in the law-making process of the Parliament. Now in this particular case, let's say for example, if there was a bill which has been sent again back to the state legislature for the reconsideration, if the state legislature passes the bill with the same majority, and even if it does not do any changes in the bill, any such reconsidered advice by the state legislature on the governor and by the parliament on the president actually becomes binding on the governor and the president, as it was enacted in the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978. But in the governor case, the governor has one extra power, and that is the governor can actually reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. Now, if the bill has been reserved by the governor for the consideration of the president, the role of the governor towards that state bill actually lapses here. And now it is complete prerogative of the president under Article 201 of the Constitution that what president may want to do with that particular bill. But what if the bill is money bill under Article 199 of the Constitution? So let's say for example you come and you offer me money. If I am, let's say for example, a corrupted person, as it is reflected by the Corruption Perception Index of released by Transparency International, our country actually ranks 96th. So we can actually assume that most of the bureaucrats and the politicians in our country are actually corrupted. If I am one of those persons, I will end up accepting the money. If I still have some ethical values of integrity, morality is still alive within me, then I will end up rejecting the money of which you have offered. But in no circumstances I will actually give a second thought what I have to do with this money. So keep this in mind that in the case of money bill, either the governor can give the assent to the bill or withhold the assent to the bill, but cannot reconsider or send the money bill back to the state legislature for the reconsideration. But also in the case of money bill, the governor can actually reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. As per the today's editorial, these power of withholding the assent, giving the assent, which is actually the sole discretion of the governor, considering there is no set parameters on which the governor can actually reject or accept the bill. So these discretionary kind of powers are actually being derived from the Government of India Act 1935, which basically provided under section 32 for Governor General and under section 75 for governors of the provinces that they will have a discretionary power to either give the assent, withhold the assent or return the bill, as we have copy pasted under article 200 of the constitution. So even when our Constituent Assembly was actually discussing the kind of the constitution which we are going to enact and discuss that for the period of 2 years, 11 months and 18 days, the idea was that under article 175 of the draft constitution, there was a term that was the governor had a written discretion to return a bill of the unicameral legislature. But when the original constitution was adopted, these particular terms were removed. So it removed the term discretion and the single house. Now when the bill has been reserved by the governor for the consideration of the president, what are the options available for the president under article 201 of the constitution? Again, president can give the assent to the bill, withhold the assent to the bill or return the bill for the reconsideration of the state legislature. Keep this in mind that again in the case of money bill, the president cannot give the assent to the bill or withhold the assent to the bill. The problem started emerging that under the original constitution, there has not been provision of any specific timeline or a time limit under which the governor and the president shall act on such bills which has been withheld by them for indefinite time period. Now there can, another question which we can put in our front of ourselves. Are there any circumstances under which the governor is actually obliged to reserve the bill for the consideration of the president? The answer is yes. And there is only one such written circumstances. So under article 200, if there is a bill which actually ends up endangering the position of High Court in the state, then it actually becomes obligatory for the governor to reserve the bill for the reconsideration of the president. Keep this in mind that in this way we can actually kind of interpret that there is a constitutional discretion which has been provided to the governor. But as it was held by the Sarkaria Commission, don't you think it is very specific in the nature? Right? So only when the bill is endangering the position of High Court, only then the governor shall actually reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. But as there lies ambiguity in the provisions of the constitution and the kind of the elastic phrasing which exists in the constitution, there has been emerged various judicial precedents and conventions where in other circumstances also the governor can actually reserve the bill under article 200 for the consideration of president, such as if the bill is against the provisions of the constitution itself. For example, if it is infringing any kind of fundamental right, or if it is opposing any directive principle of state policy, let's say article 38 which establishes our country or state as a welfare state, or if it is against the larger interest of the country, again a very wide interpretation can be drawn from this particular term, or if the bill is of grave national importance, or if it specifically deals with the compulsory acquisition of property under article 31A of the constitution. So as there has been no specific timeline which has been prescribed for the governor to make any such decision on the regards to bill or timeline for the president, don't you think that the pocket where they can actually withhold such bill and sit on the bill for indefinite time period, actually they have a pocket veto? And that's why it is actually said that the Indian president has a larger pocket than the US president. Why? Because let's say for example, if the US Congress passes a bill and that bill actually reaches on the Donald Trump's table, then as per the US Constitution, the Donald Trump shall either give the assent or withhold the assent. But any such specific action shall be taken within the time limit of 10 days. However, in case of India's president, there is no such timeline. And this has often misused to actually lead to delay legislation, a maneuver which is called as pocket veto, which ultimately transpires to policy paralysis. On the other hand, the state legislature has actually been prescribed a specific time period of 6 months, where, let's say for example, if the bill has been sent to the state assembly by the president, that okay, reconsider some provisions, I do not like this provision A, B and C, then the state legislature shall reconsider that specific provisions as referred by the president within the time limit of 6 months. So absence of such kind of a time limit for the president and governor was actually leading to delay in assenting to the bill, and that had become a kind of a source of confrontation between the opposition ruled state as well as governor. We will take example of 3 opposition ruled state. First is Tamil Nadu, where the chief minister actually held the governor as a political rival and creating a kind of a constitutional deadlock altogether. Specifically, if you guys can recall, the NEET bill, which was actually repeatedly passed by the state legislature, but the governor did not provided the assent and ultimately reserved it for the assent of the president. Or for example, in the case of Kerala, so in the post-pandemic time period, Kerala was actually trying to bring several kind of reforms in the medical sector, but Kerala was unable to do so. The reason for that was that the bills which were actually passed by the Kerala's Legislative Assembly, they did not got the assent by the governor of Kerala, and thus they never saw the light of day, leading to the defeat of the right of the people, because the governor, which is not elected by the people, is indefinitely sitting on such crucial bill. Thus, the West Bengal's the chief minister actually stated that how state administration has been brought to a grinding halt. We can actually take a cue from the today's editorial, where it provides us a very insightful comment which was made by Ram Krishna Hegde, who was the former chief minister of Karnataka. He wrote that how president, back in the year of 1991, he wrote this, where he said that the president had yet to give assent to as many as 74 bills which were referred by the state governor. 2 of such bill has been pending for 7 years. 2 of them have been pending from 5 years. 7 for 3 years, and 58 bills are actually pending for 1 year. He wrote that how after making us wait for 6 years, the Home Ministry has recently replied to the state government that the educational bill which we had passed back in the year of 1983 is actually under examination. So considering these issues, these federal issues which were emerging, the Supreme Court gave a landmark judgment in the month of April in State of Tamil Nadu versus Governor of Tamil Nadu 2025, where it ended up prescribing a very specific timeline for the governor and the president to follow, where it said that if the governor is withholding the assent of bill or want to reserve it for the president under Article 200, as per the state government advice, then they shall make such decision within 1 month. If you want to withhold the assent of the bill against the state government's advice, or if you want to reserve that bill for the president against the state government advice, then take at least 3 months for consideration. To grant assent to the bill after it has been reenacted by the state assembly, the governor shall do that within the time period of 1 month. So basically, a kind of a specific timeline was set by the Supreme Court on the governors as well as on the president to actually act upon the bills of the state legislature. And if this timeline is actually being kind of violated by the governor, then the state government could actually, kind of approach the court and ask for judicial review. Thus, using power under Article 143, which actually authorizes the president, who is the head of the country, to seek opinion of the Supreme Court, there was a presidential reference which was made. So what is this power under Article 143? Where the president can actually seek advisory opinion of the Supreme Court, and this is also called as advisory jurisdiction power of Supreme Court. So there are 2 instances. First is, if there is any question of law or fact of public importance which has arisen or is going to arise in the future, in this particular case, Supreme Court can either tender its advice or even refuse to tender its opinion to the president. But if there is any dispute which is arising out of pre-constitutional treaty, agreement or sanad which has been made, then Supreme Court actually must tender its opinion. It becomes binding on it. This was in the nature of the first. It was a question of law or a fact of public importance. So Supreme Court might have said that I do not want to give my opinion. But again, it is a presidential reference made by the head of the country. So the Supreme Court has to give the opinion. Keep this in mind that whatever the opinion has been given by the Supreme Court to the President, it is only advisory in the nature and not becomes binding on the President. So what were the questions which were raised by the presidential reference and what is the answer which has been given by the Supreme Court? Let's try to understand that, and these contain very important terms for your prelims and very important points for your mains answer. So the 14 questions and the court's responses. The presidential reference which came under the April 8 judgment of the Supreme Court that granted deemed assent to the 10th Tamil Nadu bill. First question. Is the governor bound by the aid and advice which is tendered by the Council of Ministers under Article 200? To which Supreme Court answered that governor enjoys discretion in this case and is not bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Second, is the exercise of constitutional discretion by the governor under Article 200 is justiciable? The Supreme Court said that no, it is not justiciable. So let's say, for example, if the governor has not given assent to a state bill, you cannot directly approach the court, but it also basically created a kind of a preventive safeguard, where Supreme Court held that, however, in glaring circumstances of indefinite action. So let's say in the case of, let's say for example, when we were referring to the former Chief Minister of Karnataka who said that the education bill is actually kind of being held for almost 6 years. So in such case of inaction for a very long period of time, court has a limited power to issue a kind of a mandamus to the governor, which is a writ jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, to decide within a reasonable time period. Then there are a lot of immunities which are provided to the governor and president under Article 361 of the Constitution. For example, no criminal proceedings can be initiated against the governor when he is in that position or in the office. No criminal proceedings basically implies that if you are a governor and you end up killing a person, even in that case, no criminal proceeding will be initiated against you. However, keep this in mind that a civil proceeding can actually be initiated, but only after giving a notice of 2 months. The same Article 361 also actually bars the court to examine any action which has been taken by the governor in his or her position in the office under Article 153 of the Constitution. So the question was that is Article 361 is an absolute bar to the judicial review in relation to the action of the governor under Article 200. To which Supreme Court said that Article 361 is an absolute bar on judicial review in relation to personally subjecting the governor to judicial proceeding. So obviously no personal action will be taken against the governor. That governor as a person will not be held liable for any withholding of the bill for a long period of time. However, governor as a kind of a symbol of a state can be held liable. So keep this in mind that judicial review still applies to the position of governor. Can timelines be imposed under Article 200? No. So now there are no timelines, as Supreme Court held that it is not appropriate to impose such timeline because Constitution is completely silent on this. And can the exercise of constitutional power and the order of president or governor can be substituted in any manner under Article 142, which basically provides the power to the Supreme Court to do a complete justice, to which Supreme Court held that it cannot be substituted, as Article 142 does not allow for the concept of deemed assent of the bill. So the assent which was provided to the bill of the Tamil Nadu has now been withdrawn. But keep this in mind that this very specific innovation of timeline for the president and governor, it was not a kind of an act of isolation by the Supreme Court. Rather, they actually derived it from various judicial precedents, where they refer to P. Nambudiri versus State of Kerala, which has basically said that the Constitution farmer did not intend for a bill pending assent to be at the risk of lapsing on the dissolution, and thus the assent shall be provided by the governor in a quick manner. In D.P. Ghosh versus the State of West Bengal 1972, Supreme Court basically interpreted the phrase that the governor shall act as soon as possible, as early as practicable without avoidable delay. The National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, also called as Venkatacharya Constitution, actually prescribed a specific time limit, desirably 6 months, to give the assent or to reserve a bill for the consideration of the President. And if you guys can recall, when we were discussing about the Speaker, K.M. Singh versus Speaker of Manipur case 2020, Supreme Court has already prescribed a time limit of 3 months, reasonable time within which the speaker shall act on the disqualification under the anti-defection law, which has been enacted under the 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1985. So Supreme Court actually withdrawn from the judicial precedent and set the similar kind of a timeline for the governor. Also keep this in mind that Supreme Court has already held that, let's say for example, governor is an independent constitutional office and not act as a kind of a office of employment under the central government. Similarly, it also does not imply that governor has kind of, unfettered discretionary power. So Supreme Court has also provided several important judicial judgments on the discretionary power of the governor. For example, in the Shamsher Singh versus State of Punjab, Supreme Court held that governor shall act only on the advice of Council of Minister under Article 163. In Nabbam Rabia case 2016, Supreme Court held that only those matters where the Constitution expressly permit the governor to act autonomously, that cannot be challenged before a court. Like for example, if the bill was endangering a position of High Court, then it is a kind of an obligation on the governor to reserve the bill for the president. So in that case, judicial review will not apply. In Rameshwar Prasad versus Union of India, the judicial immunity under Article 361 is not absolute and can be challenged in the court. That was the opinion which was held by the Supreme Court. The today's article actually provides some very interesting debate. So for example, from a parliament chapter, you guys can recall that a bill which has been passed by one house and is actually pending in other house lapses in certain circumstances. For example, under Article 107 clause 5, such a bill is actually lapses if it is not passed by the Lok Sabha before its dissolution, or if it has been passed by the Lok Sabha but pending in the Rajya Sabha. Why this bill actually lapses? Because now there can be a change in the government. So the new government which will come, obviously that will try to bring new policies. So for example, discarding the kind of a planning commission and creation of Niti Aayog can take place. So obviously the bill which was related to the planning commission will actually end up lapsing. This is the argument which has been used by the today's editorial, where it says that let's say if there takes place a political change, there will come a new party, Party B. And obviously that Party B will now advise the governor to send back the bill to the legislature. That no, don't consider this bill. Right? You have not given the assent till now, just send it back. The idea is that obviously there does not exist implied discretion in Article 200 which has been given to the governor in this case. Then Supreme Court, when it was discussing about the power of discretion, it actually held that we cannot completely debar the governor from exercising any discretionary power. Why? Because if there does not exist such discretion, then what will happen if the bill which has been passed by the state legislature is actually non-constitutional in the nature? And then if we actually end up making any advice by the Council of Minister under Article 163 binding on the governor, then obviously such non-constitutional advice also becomes binding. So the article today actually raises three very important arguments. First, the member of Council of Minister, they actually take oath to owe their allegiance to the Constitution. Why? They will first render such non-constitutional or anti-constitutional advice. Second, if such unconstitutional advice is tendered to the governor, she can actually report to the union under Article 356, right? Article 365, failure of constitutional machinery. Thus, he can actually suggest for the imposition of precedent rule under Article 356. Now, even for such advice, whether the aid and advice of Council of Minister is actually required or not, and does the President have any discretionary power if such advice has been tendered by the Union Cabinet? So keep these three very interesting arguments in your mind. They will actually form the basis for the future decisions which will be taken. And try to attempt this particular question. We move forward to the next news, where the editorial highlights the use of technology and Aadhaar card as an electoral document and suggests some innovative steps for its future adoption, which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of government policies and intervention. So recently, the issue of citizenship as well as what are the official documents through which I can actually prove my citizenship, that became the center of debate in the context of the special intensive revision exercise of electoral rolls which was brought by the Election Commission of India right before the Legislative Assembly elections which were about to take place in Bihar. So the problem was that the Election Commission of India was saying that we are going to conduct a special intensive revision. Now, what will be the eligible documents to actually prove that whether I'm a citizen of India or I'm a resident of Bihar? Keep this in mind that this idea of citizenship in our country, first and foremost, who actually provides this data or provides or authenticate that whether you are a citizen of India or not. So that is actually done by the Registrar General of Citizen, which actually works under the Ministry of Home Affairs. And then this whole idea of citizenship is actually regulated under the Citizenship Act of 1955, which basically state that the central government may compulsorily register every citizen of India and issue a national identity card. Also, it will create a national register of Indian citizen only after verifying the citizenship status of all the people in the National Population Register. So when the Election Commission of India is actually going to conduct this special intensive revision exercise, does it had any kind of legal and constitutional basis? The answer is yes. Under Article 324 of the Constitution itself, Election Commission of India has plenary constitutional power to conduct, supervise and revise the electoral rolls. Then under the Section 21 of Representation of People Act 1950, the Election Commission of India has actually authority to conduct a special intensive revision of electoral rolls. As it was stated by the Election Commission of India, that their objective was to actually update the electoral rolls. At the same point of time, one of the objective was to actually kind of extract the illegal migrants which were living in the region, which is again the mandate of Ministry of Home Affairs. Then the Section 28 of Representation of People Act 1950. The Election Commission of India actually has power to give binding directions to the Chief Election Officer regarding the documents which will be required. And these actions by the Election Commission of India has actually been upheld in the Supreme Court as well in the Public Union Civil Liberties Judgment 2003, where it held that yes, indeed, Election Commission of India can identify and specify some various identity and verification requirement. So when the ECI actually started this SIR exercise in Bihar, it actually provided for 11 eligible documents which the resident of Bihar could actually provide to prove their identity, to prove their residentship of Bihar, as well as that they are the citizen of India. Documents such as, for example, identity card, which were issued prior to 1st of July 1987, the permanent residence or forest rights certificate, caste certificate, any such family register which is prepared by the state authorities, land or house allotment certificate, educational certificate, or your birth certificate or passport, or any pension payment order by the central or the state government. But keep this in mind that originally Aadhaar card was not included in this 11 eligible document to prove nationality or the kind of residentship in Bihar by the Election Commission of India. However, the Supreme Court actually directed that Aadhaar is actually the part of the statute and thus it can be used by the voter, where it cited that under the Section 23 of the RPA 1950, it actually permits the Election Commission of India to use Aadhaar to authenticate the residentship of the people, that whether they are the residents of Bihar or not. Keep this in mind, not citizenship. Why not citizenship? To understand that, let's first try to understand what actually is Aadhaar. So as per the definition which has been provided to us by the Unique Identification Authority of India, which is a statutory body created through Aadhaar Act of 2016 and functions under the Ministry of Electronics and IT, it actually states that this 12-digit number of Aadhaar is actually a unique identification verification number which is provided to any individual which is residing in our country under the Aadhaar Act of 2016, where it serves two important purposes. The first is it acts as a proof of identity, and the second is it acts as a proof of address for the resident and not, remember, the proof of citizenship. Why not? Because who can actually register for this Aadhaar card? Keep this in mind that any resident of India of any nationality, irrespective of their age or sex, can actually register for Aadhaar card. So for example, today we are also going to discuss about the volcano which has actually erupted in Ethiopia. Let's say there is a 5-year-old Ethiopian girl who, because to actually save herself from this eruption of volcano, has actually migrated to India. Even she can actually get an Aadhaar card. The only idea is that this Aadhaar card number which is being generated, it is unique for each individual and is actually valid for lifetime. So let's say, for example, if I want to get benefit from any government scheme, is Aadhaar card mandatory for availing such government services? Yes, indeed. Section 7 of Aadhaar Act 2016 actually mandates the requirement of Aadhaar for benefit and subsidies of the scheme, any such scheme which is being funded out of the Consolidated Fund of India or state. Just look at the headline, how such mandatory Aadhaar authentication has led to exclusion of various marginalized people from the public distribution system. Why? Because PDS is being funded on Consolidated Fund of India, and to avail the PDS or subsidize food under PDS, you are actually required to have Aadhaar card. Then you are also required for the filling of income tax return, as well as it is also linked with your permanent account number, that is PAN. Can Aadhaar card be considered as a proof of date of birth or your age? Another good interesting question. Now here exist discrepancies within the government bodies itself. They actually take different interpretation that whether Aadhaar card can be considered as a proof of date of birth or not. For example, as per EPFO, no, Aadhaar card is not proof of date of birth. But for Election Commission of India, which is actually required to ascertain your age, why? Because under the 61st Constitutional Amendment Act of 1989, it actually establishes universal adult franchise in our country. So the moment you people actually become 18 years of age, you are eligible to elect your representative in the parliament or state legislature. And thus to ascertain your age, the Election Commission of India actually held this Aadhaar card as a valid proof of date of birth or your age. Then what Aadhaar card is definitely not. Keep this in mind. There will not take place any profiling on the basis of caste, religion or language. So it upholds the constitutional directives of Article 14 and Article 15. Can anybody tell me in the comment box what are the specific provisions under Article 14 and 15 of the Constitution? Revision of your fundamental rights. Second, it is actually not mandatory for every Indian resident to have Aadhaar card. And ultimately, any information which is not available, the information under Aadhaar card is not available to all public or private entities. So it also contains certain sensitive information and it will only be shared by the government agencies on ad hoc basis, case by case basis. So is there any benefit that we shall have Aadhaar card? As per the Bombay High Court, as it held in the judgment in 2022, it actually said that Aadhaar card has actually led to financial inclusion in our country. For example, it has actually led to promotion of transparent and good governance. So let's take the example of public distribution system itself. Now let's say, for example, you are a beneficiary under the public distribution system and you have an Aadhaar card. So under this Aadhaar card linked Jan Dhan bank account which you have opened, now this subsidized ration is actually being provided to you as a kind of a direct benefit transfer to the beneficiary. And thus you are getting a subsidized food under National Food Security Act 2013, which aims to provide subsidized food to 66% of the population of our country. The idea is that don't you think such Aadhaar card based identification of the primary beneficiary has actually led to decline in red tapeism or bureaucratic hurdles, as well as it has also kind of reduced the siphoning of funds which could take place because of the existence of intermediaries, middlemen, etc. And thus it has actually led to the kind of declining the scope of corruption as well. For example, take the case of Pahal scheme itself. When you actually go to take the LPG cylinder, first you pay for the LPG cylinder at the MRP price. But then under this Aadhaar card linked Jan Dhan account which you have opened, the government transfer you all the subsidized amount. So there is existence of no middlemen or intermediaries anymore. At the same point of time, through this purpose, the governance has actually reached the bottom of pyramid and we have been able to provide income support to Antyodaya. So this JAM Trinity, which basically consists of Jan Dhan accounts linked with your Aadhaar card, thus establishing a very valid proof of identity through a mobile interface, through internet connectivity, has actually led to increasing financial inclusion. For example, from 2014, the people who have bank account, they have increased by 270%. And as per the data by the ministry, till the year of 2024, we had around 54 crore people who had now bank accounts. The money of, the transfer of money taking place, kind of playing a very pivotal role in the money multiplier as well. Then you can actually store this data very safely on the DigiLocker, which is backed by the government. Then there is mandatory linking of your Aadhaar card with the voter ID card to actually kind of siphon out the bogus voter ID card which existed, the dead accounts which existed, as well as to actually link it with your PAN account number to ensure that there is no illegal transfer of money is taking place for illicit activities. And that is the trail which the Ministry of Home Affairs is following now to actually trace the culprits of Red Fort blast. Various arrests has made recently. So now, don't you think by creation of such Aadhaar card, the government has actually moved towards more people-centric governance? However, there lies various persisting issues in Aadhaar card. The first and foremost is that there is taking place the biometric verification failure. There are various reasons which has been cited by the Unique Identification Authority of India, which manages this Aadhaar card. It is saying that, let's say for example, in the case of MGNREGA workers, there are these people who are actually doing hard labor. They are not having white collar jobs, sitting in their air conditioned atmosphere. So many of the time their fingerprints actually gets erased or it does not match with the machine, leading to the biometric authentication failure. Or let's say for example, the iris pattern of elderly people does not matches. So these issues actually creates the issue of false negative, which leads to the exclusion of eligible beneficiaries. And don't you think that basically implies that there is taking place a failure in the service delivery of public services? For example, take up this particular case study where there was a girl 11 years age who actually died begging for rice. Why? Because the child's family was refused subsidized food, allegedly because their ration card did not linked with the Aadhaar unique ID number. Or there is taking place the various technological hurdles. The biometric authentication also requires sound digital infrastructure. In this case, just recall the report which was released by Center for Internet Study, which stated that how in our country there exist only 54% people who actually uses smartphones. Or even today the 46% of the rural villages does not have fast internet connectivity. So such sound digital infrastructure requires what? Uninterrupted power supply, functioning of these POS machines, kind of advocate mobile and internet connectivity, is smooth functioning of data repository services. But in the failure of all of this, don't you think such lack of sound digital infrastructure will end up jeopardizing the initiatives of Aadhaar card altogether? Also, keep this in mind that it is not a foolproof process, because even in the case of Aadhaar card, there exists the issue of duplication and delays in deactivating the cards of decease, creating ghost cards. Just look at the heading itself. Fake Aadhaar card used for property registration. Madras High Court actually directed the sub-registrar to file a police complaint. So, also there exist some data security concerns as well as which are leading to violation of right to privacy. For example, there are various banking correspondents who actually uses such Aadhaar enabled payment system and they operate without any accountability framework. Why? Because they have to complete targets. So they keep on asking the consumers for repeated Aadhaar authenticated payments and keep on sending them messages. Many of the time the consumers have actually reported the cases of illegal money withdrawal, even leading to the violation of consent. So for example, I am sitting in the rural area. First and foremost, somehow I got the internet. Then I was kind of destined to actually receive the payments from MGNREGA wages for which I had worked. So when these wages arrive, I actually realize that there is a shortage of fund here, right? So I actually go to the bank. The bank tells me that I have been automatically registered for, let's say for example, insurance for motor vehicle, which I did not ask for. ठीक है, कोई बात नहीं. The problem is I do not own motor vehicle. What I will do with this insurance now? Also, all of these issues has actually led to the violation of right to privacy, where there has been reportage of data leaks from the government servers as well, because this whole infrastructure is actually prone to cyber attacks. breaching the right to privacy, which has actually been upheld as an integral part of Article 21 under K.S. Puttaswamy judgment. Just look at the headings again. How the personal data of 851 million Indians actually got breached. However, in response to that, the Unique Identification Authority of India actually refuted this WikiLeaks report of Aadhaar data snoop and said that the system is secure. So obviously we need a very sound digital infrastructure as well and storage system as well for such massive data of more than 140 crore Indians. Otherwise, it can actually lead to the issue of violation of right to privacy. So what can be the steps which can be taken? The Center for Internet Study has actually provided for an innovative idea that we can actually switch to smart cards. What are smart cards? So instead of Aadhaar card, which actually contains very sensitive personal information like name, age, gender, our residence address and all of that, which can actually become a tool of, let's say for example, various kind of digital arrest by these cyber criminals, we can actually switch to smart cards. So let's say for example, there is government and government want to give some benefit to me, direct benefit transfer to me, and I am the beneficiary. So for every such direct benefit transfer, I can have a specific smart card which contains a very unique verification number. And for each such transaction, a specific PIN can be generated on the name of this unique verification number. And I can share that PIN with the government, and thus the government can transfer this direct benefit transfer. Just like we have a PIN for our ATM cards, and we can keep on changing the PINs as well. Then the government shall kind of issue a directive to actually limit the use of Aadhaar specifically in the public domain. For example, even to buy the SIM cards, we actually end up providing our Aadhaar card and thus providing a very important sensitive information which can actually be sold to various corporates. And thus for such protection of privacy of ours, we can actually link the Aadhaar card with the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023. As well as in this direction, the government has brought an Aadhaar Amendment Rule of 2025, under which it has specifically said that now any such transfer of data of the public, sensitive data of the public to any non-government entity will only be take place if they have taken permission from the concerned ministry. In this direction, we can also borrow the cue from Supreme Court's 2018 ruling, where it restricted the private entity uses of any such sensitive data. What does today's editorial suggest? It suggests for some innovative ways through which we can actually use Aadhaar card very efficiently to actually link it with the voter ID card and act as a kind of a proof of identity. For example, it suggests that citizens may be offered the facility of Aadhaar authentication, ideally face-based, via a smartphone or with assistance at a common service center. Those who authenticate are automatically marked as verified alive. Only the reminder people should be require a field verification by the election officers. Second, a secure portal can be created, which can allow a near 18-year-old to authenticate with Aadhaar and submit the equivalent of Form 6 digitally itself. Those who find it challenging can actually visit an assisted kiosk which can be created by the Election Commission of India. Any such anomalies in the addresses, such as for example tens of voters at non-existence house number or clearly fictitious entities, like let's say for example if there is Selena Gomez who is coming to vote in Bihar election. So in the case of such fictitious entities, it can be algorithmically flagged by cross-checking electoral addresses against the Aadhaar address field. Booth level officers can then investigate a much smaller and more meaningful list of suspect entries. So keep this suggestions in your mind also for the purpose of electoral reforms which can be suggested. Attempt this question and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to read about a recent deal for vaccination purpose which has been signed by Gavi and UNICEF. So Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which basically act as a kind of a public-private partnership, which actually sources its funding from various institutions like World Health Organization, World Bank, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It has actually tied with United Nations Children Fund UNICEF, and they have announced a new agreement which says that they are going to make R21 Matrix M malaria vaccines significantly more accessible and affordable. So now the vaccine cost is actually going to brought down to $2.7 and thus paving the way for the protecting more children. The deal will actually be executed by the UNICEF, which is expected to generate up to $90 million in savings for Gavi and countries, equivalent to more than 30 million additional doses of malaria vaccines which will be created, thus enabling full vaccination of nearly 7 million more children against malaria over the course of next 5 years till 2030. And this funding will be facilitated through a very innovative international finance facility for immunization mechanism. Keep this in mind that it is Gavi, this vaccine alliance, which actually provides 40 million doses of malaria vaccines in 24 African countries. These 24 African countries which basically act as a hub for malaria and thus contribute to 70% of the world's malaria burden. In 2023, malaria ended up claiming 6 lakh lives. 95% of them actually took place in African region. So, what is this lingering threat of malaria? Malaria is an increasing threat to global health also because of the rapid urbanization which is taking place, and that is basically leading to unplanned urbanization, paving way for various water bodies which act as sprouting grounds for the mosquitoes, the extreme weather events, the water logging issues which prevails. Malaria is actually a parasitic infection which is transmitted by the mosquito. Now pay attention. Only female Anopheles mosquitoes can actually spread malaria, and it leads to what? Seizures, fluid in lungs, organ damage and up to death. However, our country has taken some pragmatic steps which we'll discuss as well. So in our country there has been actually 80% drop in the cases from 2014 to 2024. However, there are various belts where malaria still prevails and threatens the life of people, such as for example in Odisha, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. Keep this in mind that there are various such diseases which are caused by mosquito like malaria and dengue, West Nile virus, Zika virus, yellow fever, lymphatic filariasis as well as chikungunya. So what our government has done in this regard? The Indian Council of Medical Research has actually developed an indigenous vaccine, that is Adfalki-Vax, where it has used a kind of a very specific technology which is called as chimeric recombinant vaccine, which actually uses different part of genes of a pathogen and thus create target proteins to trigger a very specific immune response. Did we not had vaccine before this Adfalki-Vax? A question which can appear in your mind. We had. The vaccines were RTS-S and R21. They were approved by the Indian Council of Medical Research, but they had efficacy of only 75%. So only 7 out of 10 patients were actually not incurring malaria after having these vaccines. Thus, the Indian Council of Medical Research has made this Adfalki-Vax, which unlike this RTS-S actually uses CSP protein. Right? So RTS-S basically works upon CSP protein system. But this Adfalki-Vax actually works on Pro6C protein, which actually has more stronger immune response. It uses adjuvant alum, which does not pose any kind of risk of chronic inflammation also. So it seems to be much more beneficial than this RTS-S and R21, but here is a catch and a very interesting one. This Adfalki-Vax actually works against Plasmodium falciparum. But in our country, the malaria is actually caused by the parasite which is Plasmodium vivax. So this Adfalki-Vax is basically incapable to treat malaria or act as a vaccine to malaria in our country. Then there are several other steps which has been taken by the government of India. First and foremost, it has provided license to 5 arms to manufacture its first indigenous malaria vaccine. Then it has actually created a national framework to eliminate malaria by the year of 2030. For which we have also launched a national vector-borne disease control program. We are basically working under the World Health Organization's larger high burden to high impact initiative, where we are also integrating the technology by digitalization and surveillance, creating an integrated health information platform. And to actually sensitize the people about how to prevent against the malaria, the Indian Council of Medical Research has also launched a malaria elimination research alliance called as Mera India. So keep these provisions in your mind. Keep these 2 vaccines in your mind which can appear in your prelims examination, and we move forward to the next news, where we are actually going to learn about the appointment procedure of Chief Justice of India and Supreme Court judges in the context of Justice Suryakant being appointed as the 53rd Chief Justice of India. where he was actually sworn in by our President Draupadi Murmu. Keep this in mind that Justice Kant actually acted as a member of the 16th Presidential Reference Bench, which advised the President that neither she nor the state governors, while dealing with the state bills, are actually bound by the timelines which are imposed by the Supreme Court. And Justice Kant actually took this oath in the oath of office in Hindi. So, unlike the American Constitution, which provides for a kind of a separate judiciary system for federations as well as center, in our country there exists a integrated judicial system where there is Supreme Court, then High Court, and under High Court there exist several district courts and subordinate courts. This has been adopted again from the Government of India Act 1935, and these courts basically enforces both central as well as state laws. Currently, the judges' strength in Supreme Court is 34, and that was basically provided by the Supreme Court Amendment Act of 2019. 34 judges including the Chief Justice of India. Chief Justice of India, as you guys can see in the news, as well as the judges of Supreme Court are actually appointed by the President of India. But what is the procedure of appointment? So in the Constitution, it is written that when the President is appointing the judges of the Supreme Court as well as Chief Justice of India, the President may consult with the judges of Supreme Court as the President may like. Then now you guys can recall the tussle which was taking place between judiciary and the Indira Gandhi government at that point of time. That basically led to the first judges case of 1982, where it was held by Supreme Court that such judges which are appointed by the President after consultation with Chief Justice of India and other judges of Supreme Court and High Court, but such consultation does not directly mean concurrence and only implies the exchange of views. So even if CGI says that, let's say for example, make this student who is watching analyst on daily basis as a judge of Supreme Court, it was not binding on the President at that point of time. But this opinion was reversed by the Supreme Court in the second judge's case of 1993, where it held that any such consultation and exchange of views actually implies concurrence. So the advice which is tendered by the Chief Justice of India to the President to appoint the next person as the judge of the Supreme Court is actually binding on the President. And such advice shall be taken not only by the CGI, it is not his or her sole opinion. Rather, plurality of judges' opinion matters. So CGI plus 2 senior most judges shall be consulted. In third judge's case of 1998, it said that such consultation basically implies the opinion of plurality of judges and thus created a collegium system which exists even today and consists of CGI plus 4 senior most judges of the Supreme Court. Keep this in mind that this seniority factor is actually decided by the date on which the particular person has been appointed as the judge of Supreme Court. So basically the number of years for which you are working for the Supreme Court, that decides your seniority level and not your age. Okay? 2 judges give adverse opinion. Let's say for example there are 4 senior most judges. Even if 2 senior most judges says that no, even if this person is watching analyst on daily basis and not writing answer and thus give adverse opinion against you, so CGI shall not send the recommendation to the President. Now again, judges are being appointed by the judges itself. So it is basically an in-house mechanism. To actually bring more transparency in this appointment procedure, the central government created a National Judicial Appointment Commission in 2014, but keep this in mind that in the 4th judge's case of 2015, this was actually struck down by the Supreme Court. Try to attempt this question. Now, what are the special powers of CGI? Why someone will want to become CGI? First and foremost, CGI is the master of the roster, and thus in this capacity, he decides which bench will hear which cases. Even the composition of bench, so that let's say for example to hear this particular case, when you have filed an application that they are not making me a judge even though I am watching analyst every day. In this particular case, the composition of bench, that whether 2 judges will hear your case or 3 judges will hear your case, that is decided or is a sole prerogative of the CGI, Chief Justice of India. And this power has been actually upheld by the Supreme Court itself in Ashok Pandey versus Supreme Court case of 2018. Then it is actually CGI who appoints either an ad hoc judge or a retired judge. So under Article 127, CGI can appoint a High Court judge as an ad hoc judge, case to case basis for a limited time period, but with prior approval of President. Similarly, CGI can actually request a retired judge that there are a lot of cases, we are only 34 people, there are a lot of vacancies in the Supreme Court, and thus you can actually come back and act as a judge of Supreme Court for a short time period, but again only with the prior consent of President. Now for appointment of CGI, there is an established convention which prevailed from 1950 to 1973 that the senior most judge on the basis of date of joining was actually appointed as the CGI. This has been broken two times, one in 1973 when Indira Gandhi government appointed A.N. Rai as CGI, superseding three senior most judges. Again in 1977, Indira Gandhi appointed M.U. Beg as CGI, superseding the senior most judge. So from second judge's case of 1993, it has established as a kind of a practice that senior most judge alone will be appointed as the Chief Justice of India. Comment the answer of the prelims question in the comment box and we move forward to the next news, where we'll try to understand the quick learning and numeracy gap which exists in our country. And the context for the news is the article today actually highlights that how the National Education Policy 2020, which we have discussed in the last lecture, actually rightly identifies the foundational literacy and numeracy as the cornerstone of all future learning. So for example, if I have not developed command on the language of English from very early stage, don't you think I will find it very difficult to actually express myself at a stage like this in the old times as well? So the foundational literacy and numeracy is very important. Thus, the Nipun Bharat mission of the Government of India has translated these policies' intent into action by focusing on learning outcomes rather than just input. So foundational learning outcomes, like which has been stagnant for decades, they have actually shown measurable improvement as confirmed by the government. But despite these gains, keep this in mind that numeracy continues to lag behind literacy. So literacy is something that if I am able to comprehend, let's say for example, a piece of information, I would be considered as a literate person by the definition of the government. However, the annual State of Education Report 2024 highlights that how 48.7% of class 5 students only can read fluently. So almost more than 50% cannot. Or how only 30.7% can solve a basic division problem at the grade 3 level. 70% of them cannot even solve this basic division problem. So don't you think such missed concepts in lower grade will actually lead to future complex concepts inaccessible for such people? So NGO Pratham has actually highlighted that this grade level teaching, that okay, if you have got, let's say for example 30% also, you will be basically transferred to the next class. But that also implies that that person was unable to kind of learn and comprehend the rest 70% of the syllabus. How he will understand the much more complex syllabus of the next class? As well as passing the exam approach, just rote learning on which even you guys are focusing upon instead of understanding these issues which we are discussing. So there basically lies a complete disconnect between the school learning and the real life application, and to solve these problems, the government has brought two important initiatives which you guys will mention in your education sector. First is Nipun Bharat, to actually establish universal foundational literacy and numeracy. The idea is that by 2027, every child in grade 3 shall achieve foundational competency in three things: reading, writing and numeracy, where we shall actually impart learning. Now take the cue from the Varda scheme 1937 which we discussed in the last lecture. If anybody can comment the specific provisions of that for a recall exercise. So Varda scheme 1937 actually adopted the idea of Nai Talim by Gandhi ji, where we shall actually focus on activity-based learning. Learn through plays, discovery modules, activity-based learning. And for that purpose, the capacity building of teachers is also required. And for that purpose, the government has brought Nishtha scheme, as well as doing a continuous assessment and monitoring of the students through group work, quizzes, short tests, asking students to actually comment down the answer, involve them in some activities, as well as the provisions of PM Shri, the rising schools of our country, for which the idea is to upgrade 14,500 existing schools into the model school with modern infrastructure. Keep this in mind, it is a centrally sponsored scheme which was launched in National Education Policy 2020. And it basically provides for a school quality assessment framework called as Parak. Under the larger objective of Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, which aims to basically provide the kind of the fundamental right which people have under Article 21A of the Constitution, where there shall be compulsory primary education which shall be provided by the state for the students of age 6 to 14 years. Okay? And this particular provision or article was added by which constitutional amendment? Activity-based learning we are doing. Keep this in mind that our Prime Minister has held that such national education policy has actually transformed our education sector in recent years. And the PM Shri schools are further going to benefit lakhs of students. Through what? Through a very specific monitoring mechanism which has been created. Specifically, when you guys will become district collector in the future, and I hope you will be heading a committee to actually assess the schools in your district. Also, over 18 lakh students are expected to be the direct beneficiaries of the scheme, and which it will generate through the mentoring and hand holding of the school. And it is a centrally sponsored scheme. The total project cost is approximately 27,360 crore. The central share is approximately 18,128 crore, and it is a mission mode scheme till the year of 2027. With this, we move forward to the next news, where the Reserve Bank of India's governor has held that if we analyze the macroeconomic data, there is still actually a good scope to cut down the repo rate further. Further cutting down of the repo rate, the interest rate are actually going to become cheaper. More money will actually be infused in the market. The propensity to consume of the consumer is actually going to increase, creating what? Creating demand for Indian products. So, to basically create more employment. That is the idea. Now, what does the article says? The article says that the fiscal and the monetary steps which has been announced in the current years, it will actually lead to a virtuous cycle of private investment and growth. How? So, in order to support such economic growth, the government and the Reserve Bank of India has actually announced a slew of measures, where we have basically rationalized the GST. We have actually provided relief even in the income tax. And there is almost a 1% reduction in the repo rate which has been done. What is this repo rate? How through it RBI actually manages the inflation? And first and foremost, why it is required to do so? So the Finance Act of 2016 actually amended the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934 and provided inflation targeting as its primary objective of the monetary policy. Where Reserve Bank of India has taken a task on itself that we are going to maintain the inflation as ideally up to 4% of consumer price index inflation. There can be a kind of a maneuvering or a tolerance band. So it can range from 2% to 6%. And such target range validity is till 31st of March 2026. If it goes beyond 6% for 3 consecutive quarters, that is 9 months, or if it falls below 2% for 3 consecutive quarters, that is 9 months, then there also lies an accountability clause, where RBI will be required to report the government about the reason and the remedial action which it has taken. For this purpose, there is creation of a specific committee that is called as Monetary Policy Committee, which consists of 6 members, RBI Governor, Deputy Governor, RBI official, and 3 members which are nominated by the government. So how RBI actually ensure this target of 4% CPI inflation with plus minus 2% tolerance band? First and foremost, through your repo rate adjustment. What is repo rate? Repo rate is the rate at which RBI provides the loan to the bank. So let's say, for example, if RBI will increase the repo rate, the borrowing will become costlier for the bank. Thus, the banks will not give loans to the common people like you. You will not create business. You will not create business, less employment. Less employment, less money with the people. I don't have job. How I will create demand? Less demand, less inflation. But as the government is saying, we are going to cut down repo rate more. There is more scope. So now the borrowing is actually going to get cheaper. Banks will borrow more from RBI. Thus give more loans to you people. You people will create new business. More employment for people like me. And thus more demand, high inflation. Reverse repo rate is the rate at which banks basically end up parking their money with RBI. So if such a reverse repo rate is increased, it is actually high incentive for the bank to park money with the RBI itself. And thus they will have less money to give loans to people like Adani and Ambani, low inflation. Cash reserve ratio. So cash first and foremost. Reserve basically means Reserve Bank of India. So it is kept with RBI and that is the ratio. So that is basically, let's say, around 4%. CRR basically means the cash, the flow of the money in the liquid format, the most liquid form, that is cash, and that is kept by the bank with the RBI. SLR is statutory liquid ratio. Here the term is not cash but liquid. Liquid can be your gold also, cash also, right? Bonds also. So these are the liquid things which are kept by the bank, but here the term does not contain reserve. So the SLR is kept by the bank with themselves. If high CRR and SLR, that basically means low money with the bank to give loan, less money supply, low inflation. Sometimes RBI also manages all of this with open market operation, where RBI ends up buying the government securities and thus money with the government to do capital expenditure, high money supply, high inflation. Keep this table very dear to you for the prelims examination. 1 or 2 questions will appear from here for sure, and we move forward to the last news of the day, where a very important volcano actually has erupted. A long dormant volcano and erupted where? In Ethiopia. What is the name of it? The name is Haile Gobbi volcano, where in the Afar region of Ethiopia, which has actually erupted. Why it is important? After 10,000 years. Sending ash plumes across the Red Sea over Yemen and Oman, with parts also reaching to our country, and this eruption have set a thick plumes of smoke and volcanic ash up to 14 kilometers in the sky, thus creating difficulty in civil aviation. That is the crux of the news. In this context, remember some very important volcanoes for prelims, like very active, very frequently active volcano Mount Etna, that is in Sicily, Italy. Or volcano which is called as the lighthouse of Mediterranean, that is your Mount Stromboli in Italy, Mount Fuji in Japan, Merapi in Indonesia, Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, or the world's largest shield volcano, that is Mount Loa in USA, Hawaii, Mount St. Helens again in USA, and the one active volcano which we have, and that too in our country, that is Barren Island, and that is east of your Port Blair. It is the only active volcano in South Asia, and that's why it becomes important. Here is a complete dissection of the map of the complete Andaman and Nicobar region. So you guys can see the circling of Andaman, and then you guys can see here. This is the Coco Strait, south of which the North Andaman actually starts. The Norcondam Island actually contains an extinct volcano. Saddle Peak is the highest peak. Baratang is the dense mangroves, and here you will see the barren islands that basically contains the active volcano. Here is your South Andaman, where there is your Mahatma Gandhi National Park, Ross and Smith Islands, the name of which has been changed now. And then there is your Little Andaman. Andaman is separated from Nicobar through this 10-degree channel. So keep this map also very dear to you. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation, and thank you.